The story begins with two teenagers named CJ and Sebastian Thomas, who are recording a video of their experiment, trial number 103, on temporal relocation or teleportation across time destinations. CJ explains the tools and proton components in the tube they assembled together with her best friend Sebastian. They hope to open a wormhole and travel through time at the speed of light. Unfortunately, their attempt fails, and the time machine they created catches fire and eventually burns. The scene then shifts to a high school, where CJ and Sebastian study the world of science. In the classroom, CJ is seen reading a book on theory by Stephen Hawking while the bell rings, signaling the start of summer vacation. Meanwhile, Sebastian is gathering materials and tools needed to build the time machine in the school's lab. Their professor acknowledges that CJ and Sebastian are indeed the smartest and most genius students in school. However, the professor doubts their ability to create a time machine. Eventually, they both hurry out of school to walk home. On their way home, CJ and Sebastian are startled when they run into Eduardo, another classmate. It seems Eduardo has had a crush on CJ for a long time and often teases her, but CJ doesn't pay him any attention. Afterward, Eduardo starts questioning CJ and Sebastian about why they are collecting materials from the lab. Once again, CJ and Sebastian keep their project a secret. The scene then transitions to a convenience store, where CJ and Sebastian want to buy some drinks. Suddenly, Sebastian is harassed by a guy, who turns out to be CJ's ex-boyfriend named Jared. Jared then kisses his new girlfriend right in front of CJ and Sebastian. Naturally, CJ gets angry at Jared's behavior, leading to a commotion. However, during the commotion, CJ's brother, named Calvin, suddenly appears to protect her. The scene then continues with CJ and Sebastian returning to the garage, which turns out to be the lab where they experiment on creating the time machine. Finally, they resume their project, which they've been working on for over a year. Through their evaluation, they discover that the problem arises due to the proton tube being incompatible because of the excessive proton power. CJ arrives home late and misses dinner with her family. As a result, CJ is asked by her mother to wash the dishes. Calvin comes to help his sister, but CJ is still upset with her brother because of what happened earlier at the convenience store. Here, Calvin explains that he was only protecting her out of love. CJ and Sebastian resume recording their video for the temporal relocation trial number 104, precisely at 4:26 p.m. on June 29, 2019. CJ mentions that if the experiment succeeds, they will return to the previous day. CJ and Sebastian are then pulled into the wormhole. To their shock, when CJ checks the date on her phone, it shows June 28, 2019, which means they successfully traveled back in time by one day. They both run with joy because their mission was successful. They head to the convenience store. CJ already knows that Jared and his girlfriend are there. Finally, CJ throws a drink at Jared and his girlfriend. Unexpectedly, after that, CJ and Sebastian see their past selves entering the convenience store. Naturally, Jared is confused and starts yelling at CJ from the previous day. A commotion ensues, similar to the earlier scene. After that, CJ still doesn't accept the situation and wants to teach Jared a lesson. CJ ends up throwing another drink at Jared. CJ eventually gets caught by Jared. However, as CJ tries to free herself from Jared's grasp, a car suddenly appears and hits Jared. They both hurry back because the wormhole is about to close in 10 minutes. Upon returning to the garage lab, CJ receives news that Jared is in the hospital because his arm is broken. Sebastian tells CJ that the purpose of making the time machine was not to take revenge on her ex. CJ insists she didn't mean to harm Jared. The scene continues with Calvin, CJ's brother. While Calvin and his friend are walking and chatting, two men suddenly run by and knock the phone out of Calvin's friend's hand. Suddenly, police officers arrive on the scene. Then the police officers suddenly fire their guns, hitting both Calvin and his friend Dennis Owen. It turns out the police made a mistake, and Calvin and his friend become victims of police misidentification. CJ and her family are devastated, sad, and disappointed as they attend Calvin's funeral. Protests erupt as the community refuses to accept this wrongful incident. As the story progresses, CJ cannot accept her brother's death and decides to try saving his life using the time machine. She finally plans for Temporal Relocation Project Part 2. In the next scene, CJ visits Calvin's grave with Sebastian. They discuss their next mission regarding the Temporal Relocation Project Part 2. CJ plans to add a tube to the machine to alter the electron spin, allowing them to achieve twice the speed of light. On the other hand, this would enable them to go further back in time, from 1 day to 1 week. This is intended to save her brother Calvin. However, Sebastian is hesitant because it could result in unpredictable and unforeseen consequences, since it could alter fate if carried out. CJ is disappointed that Sebastian won't go through with it, so she leaves him alone at the grave. The next morning, CJ returns to the garage lab. Sebastian opens the door for her. CJ is surprised because, unlike usual, Sebastian's grandmother has already prepared food. Sebastian says that friends are like family, and he too loved CJ's brother Calvin very much. They finally make peace and hug. CJ then explains the chronology of Calvin's shooting that occurred 4 days ago, specifically on July 4th, when Calvin was killed at 4:47 p.m. CJ says that if they go back there and pull Calvin out of the location as planned, then Calvin could be saved. But Sebastian also mentions that the machine needs to be recalibrated for each jump, since they can only go back 1 day at a time. Moreover, the wormhole only lasts for 10 minutes. This means they only have 10 minutes to save Calvin, and everything must go perfectly. Finally, they both start upgrading the time machine. As the story progresses, they successfully travel back to July 4th, 2019. Then they rush to the scene where Calvin was shot. The timer is set for 10 minutes. But as they head to the scene, they unexpectedly run into Jared and his gang. CJ apologizes for the incident when Jared was hit by the car and says there's no time to explain. They don't pay attention to Jared. Here, CJ and Sebastian arrive late at the scene to save Calvin. In the end, they rush back again because the wormhole is about to close. CJ is disappointed, another day wasted, and she couldn't save Calvin. Back in the garage lab, CJ comes up with the idea of stopping the robbers instead. But Sebastian is reluctant because the robbers have weapons. CJ then formulates a strategy to stop the robbers. Sebastian suggests storing more energy in the time machine, eventually asking Eduardo for help, because Eduardo has a quantum circuit board that can be used to add energy to the time machine. Finally, CJ and Sebastian are ready to go back to the past to save Calvin with the upgraded time machine. Once there, CJ immediately calls the police to report a robbery and rushes to Carlito's convenience store. After arriving at Carlito's, the police don't show up, even though CJ had reported it 5 minutes earlier. Finally, CJ decides to go into the convenience store, informing the owner about the robbery. Sebastian tries to calm CJ down and asks her to be patient, but CJ doesn't listen. Past Sebastian then arrives and sees CJ entering the convenience store, approaching her. As CJ explains to Carlito, the storekeeper, then CJ realizes that she is meeting Sebastian from the past. CJ tells past Sebastian to leave the convenience store and signals Carlito to take action against the robber. Carlito finally points his gun at the robber, but the robber's accomplice also draws his gun on Carlito. Past Sebastian protects CJ when he tries to grab the robber's bag. In the end, past Sebastian is shot by the robber. Then future Sebastian begins to fade away because past Sebastian has died. CJ is shocked and deeply saddened by the loss of her best friend Sebastian. In short, Calvin, CJ's brother, finds a poster with his own picture, showing him deceased. Calvin thinks that CJ is playing a cruel joke by making such a poster. Finally, CJ explains what really happened. CJ then shows Calvin the video recording, proving that she and Sebastian had built a time machine. Calvin still doesn't believe what his sister is saying. CJ insists that she needs his help to save Sebastian. Calvin agrees to help his sister. However, there is only one time machine ready to be used. In short, CJ meets Eduardo to ask for help. Finally, CJ, Calvin, and Eduardo return to the garage lab to fix the time machine so they can save Sebastian. The next morning, CJ is ready to travel back in time to save Sebastian. Then Calvin hopes everything will be all right. Calvin gives a necklace to CJ. When she returns to the past, suddenly Sebastian is already waiting at the usual spot. But CJ is shocked to see past Sebastian and immediately hugs him. Finally, they both hurry to find Calvin in the past. The scene returns to the moment where Calvin and his friend were before the police shooting. CJ and Sebastian finally meet Calvin and his friend. CJ then urges Calvin to leave the area immediately. However, Calvin finds CJ and Sebastian's behavior strange and doesn't take them seriously. Despite CJ's warnings, Calvin continues to believe that they are joking or acting irrationally. CJ even shows Calvin the poster of his death, but Calvin still refuses to believe the gravity of the situation and dismisses it as a prank. CJ desperately tries to explain that if they don't leave the area now, both he and his friend will be killed by the police. But once again, Calvin doesn't listen. Just then, the police arrive at the scene. The officers ask for Calvin and his friend's identification, but as Calvin reaches into his pocket to pull out his phone, the police suddenly assume he is drawing a weapon, and without warning, open fire on Calvin. CJ watches in horror as her brother is shot and falls to the ground. Despite all her efforts, CJ fails to save Calvin. Sebastian, realizing that there is nothing more they can do, urges CJ to leave immediately because the wormhole will close soon. With tears in her eyes and a heavy heart, CJ reluctantly flees the scene with Sebastian. Back in the future, CJ finds herself devastated by the loss. Although Sebastian is alive again, Calvin remains dead. The scene shifts back to the garage lab where CJ explains everything to Sebastian. She tells him that he had died before. Sebastian, however, says that he wants to give up trying again because he doesn't want to risk disappearing himself or losing the people he loves. As they are about to leave, CJ suddenly shuts the garage door, leaving Sebastian outside. Sebastian quickly tries to find a way to stop CJ. By the time he manages to get inside, CJ has already gone back to the past alone to save her brother Calvin. In the end, CJ returns before everything happened, and the film ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.